You're harboring him?" The elder's voice cut through the cold morning air like a blade. Sam stepped in front of her, eyes locked with the chief. "She saved his life. That can't be a crime." But the warriors surrounding the cabin said otherwise, painted, armed, silent. This wasn't just a rescue. It was a challenge to a law older than the land itself. And by dawn, a trial would decide if mercy was worth more than tradition. Welcome to Tales by Orion. Let's uncover what really happened. Sam Ward's days had settled into a quiet rhythm, one marked by the steady creak of his porch swing and the soft whistle of prairie wind through dry grass. The cabin sat isolated against the vast expanse of the plains, a solitary refuge shaped by loss and time. Since the war had ended, and with it the life he once knew, Sam found comfort in routine. Feeding horses at dawn, mending fences before the sun rose high, and sitting by the fire at night with a worn photograph of his late wife tucked inside his coat pocket. His grief was a quiet companion, one that sat heavy in the stillness but never cried out loud. The memory of Marjorie, her laughter like a fragile melody, lingered in the corners of the cabin. The bed she once shared with him remained untouched on one side, a silent testament to absence. Nights were the hardest. The silence gnawed at the edges of his resolve. One evening, as twilight draped itself over the prairie in bruised purples and golds, a faint sound broke the stillness. It was soft at first, a staggered breath, the shuffle of weakened footsteps in snow hardened by frost. Sam's hand instinctively brushed against the cold steel of his shotgun as he stepped outside, the sharp air biting at his skin. His eyes searched the fading light, landing on a figure collapsed beneath the cedar tree near the barn. She was young, her dress torn and stained with dark blood, skin pale against the white snow. Her breath was shallow, each inhale a fragile promise of life clinging to the cold earth. Sam felt a shift inside him, a pull that was more than duty. The war had taught him to care for the wounded, but this girl carried a different kind of pain, one not born of battlefields, but of something deeper, more personal. Without hesitation, he lifted her carefully, the weight of her small body almost ghost-like in his arms. The world he had built to hold memories and solitude suddenly felt fragile and incomplete, as if her presence had torn open a door he thought was sealed forever. That night, the quiet life he had known shattered like thin ice beneath heavy boots, and Sam realized nothing would ever be the same again. The fire sputtered low in the hearth, casting flickering shadows across the cabin's rough wooden walls. Sam sat in his worn chair, his gaze fixed on the pale form wrapped in a blanket near the hearth. The girl's breath came shallow but steady, her dark hair tangled and damp against her forehead. He hadn't moved since carrying her inside, as if fear or reverence had rooted him in place. Outside, the wind whispered through the cedars, carrying a chill that seeped into the bones of the old cabin. Sam poured a cup of lukewarm coffee, the bitter taste grounding him against the weight of the unknown. He studied her more closely now, her face, marked by exhaustion and pain, but also by something fierce, something unbroken beneath the surface. Her eyes fluttered open, dark and wary. They met his with a guarded intensity, as if measuring whether he was friend or foe. She murmured words in a language Sam couldn't understand, soft and melodic, carried on a breath that seemed older than the land itself. Comanche, perhaps. He had heard tales of the tribe, long driven from these parts. Memories of a people who once roamed freely, now shadows in the corners of history. Sam set the coffee aside and reached for a basin of warm water. Gently, he lifted her hand, cleaning the dirt and dried blood from her skin. The wound on her arm was deep, but healing. His fingers moved with practiced care, stitching the torn flesh silently, the needle weaving a quiet promise between them. She watched him without fear, but also without trust. The silence between them was thick, heavy with questions neither dared to ask. Sam knew that accepting her presence here was more than an act of kindness. It was a choice that might change everything. The past was never far behind, and the laws of the land were not his to rewrite. Outside, the night deepened, stars blinking into existence like distant eyes watching their fragile truce. The stranger at the door was no longer just a girl. She was a reckoning, a story waiting to unfold, one that would pull Sam from the shadows of his grief into the uncertain light of a new dawn. The morning light crept cautiously through the cabin's narrow window, casting pale beams on the rough floorboards. The girl lay still by the fire, her breathing shallow but steady, as if each breath demanded every ounce of her strength. Sam sat nearby, quietly watching, his hands folded in his lap, wrestling with thoughts that refused to settle. Her arm was bandaged carefully, but the pain beneath the surface was deeper than any stitch could heal. There were wounds hidden from sight, scars carved by fear, loss, and a world that had turned its back on her. Sam had seen such wounds before, in the eyes of soldiers who returned broken from battles no one spoke of, in the silence that clung to those who had lost more than they could bear. He moved to the cupboard, pulling down a jar of dried herbs his wife had once prepared. Gently, he brewed a bitter tea, its sharp aroma filling the small room. The girl stirred, her eyes fluttering open again, curious despite the weariness. Sam offered the cup, his hand steady but unsure if she would accept. She took it carefully, her fingers trembling, lips pressing the rim with quiet grace. Words were scarce between them, but understanding began to form in glances and small gestures. Sam saw how she flinched at sudden sounds, how her eyes darted to shadows that held memories he could only imagine. She was a survivor, shaped by a past he couldn't fully grasp, a past marked by hardship and a longing for freedom. Outside, the wind carried the distant cry of a hawk, sharp and haunting. It was a reminder that the land held stories older than any man's grief, stories that connected them both in ways neither yet understood. Sam felt the weight of his own losses pressing against the fragile thread of hope forming in the room. He reached out, hesitating, then touched her hand lightly. The contact was brief, but meaningful, a silent promise that here, at least, wounds might begin to mend, both those seen and those hidden deep within. And in that quiet exchange, a fragile trust took root amid the shadows of their pasts. The night had settled thick and still outside the cabin, the prairie swallowed by shadows and the soft rustle of dry grass. Inside, the fire flickered low, casting a warm glow over Sam and the girl, who sat across from him on a threadbare rug. Her eyes were distant, filled with memories she could not forget, and her voice, when it came, was quiet but heavy with stories unspoken. She spoke in fragments, snatches of a language that rolled like the wind, words that carried the weight of generations and pain. Sam listened, piecing together what he could, though much remained a mystery. She spoke of a home lost, of a land taken, a family torn apart by violence and fear. Whispers of raids and broken promises hung in the air, echoing the fractured history that had shaped her people. Sam's own thoughts drifted back to his wife, Marjorie, and the story she had once shared about the tribe that had roamed these plains long before settlers arrived. Tales told in hushed tones at night, stories that felt distant until now. He saw the girl not as a stranger, but as a living thread to a past he had never fully understood. The wind outside seemed to carry their whispered histories, weaving them together in a fragile tapestry of loss and endurance. There was sorrow in the air, deep and ancient, but also a fierce resilience that neither time nor tragedy could erase. Sam reached out, placing an old, worn pendant on the floor between them, a token he kept from his father. It was simple, unadorned, yet it spoke of roots and belonging. The girl looked down at it, fingers tracing the weathered surface, a flicker of recognition crossing her face. Though their worlds were different, the past had brought them together in this cabin at the edge of the wilderness. It was a place where grief and hope mingled, where two broken souls began to find a shared language in the whispers of their histories. Outside, the night deepened, but inside, a quiet understanding blossomed, one that neither words nor time could easily unravel. The morning sun filtered weakly through frost-covered windows, casting pale light over the cabin's worn floor. Sam sat at the table, his hands wrapped around a chipped mug of coffee, the steam curling upward like the thoughts swirling in his mind. Across from him, the girl moved quietly, tending to small tasks with careful precision, sweeping the hearth, folding blankets, arranging the few possessions she had with a tenderness that belied her worn appearance. Neither spoke much. Words felt heavy and fragile, as if the weight of what lay ahead was too much for language alone. The silence between them was not empty. It hummed with unspoken questions and the slow, steady pulse of shared uncertainty. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the cabin walls and carrying with it the distant sound of hooves. Sam's gaze flickered to the window, tension tightening in his chest. He knew what those sounds meant. The approach of others, eyes watching, judgment waiting just beyond the trees. The girl paused in her work, her dark eyes meeting his for a long moment. No plea, no demand, only the quiet acceptance of the choice she faced. Sam felt the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders, not just for her safety, but for the fragile trust that had begun to take root between them. He stood slowly, moving to the door and opening it against the cold. The morning air bit sharply, but it cleared the fog from his mind. The decision he had long avoided now pressed forward with clarity. To shelter her was to challenge the world he'd tried to keep at bay, to invite danger and upheaval into his carefully guarded solitude. Yet, as he looked back inside, he saw more than a wounded stranger. He saw a spark of something fierce and unyielding, a will to survive that mirrored his own. The silence between them spoke louder than words, a pact forged not in promises, but in the shared understanding of what it meant to fight for life when the world seemed determined to take it away. Sam closed the door against the wind, the echo sealing their unspoken vow. Whatever came next, they would face it together. The wind carried a low, haunting whistle through the tall grass, as if the prairie itself whispered warnings Sam had long tried to ignore. The girl sat near the fire, her fingers tracing patterns on a worn piece of leather, her expression distant and thoughtful. Sam felt the weight of her silence, heavier than any spoken word, knowing it held histories and laws older than the land beneath their feet. That afternoon, a shadow fell across the cabin's threshold. Sam looked up to see a figure standing in the doorway, a man with eyes sharp as flint and a presence that demanded respect. His weathered face was marked by years under the sun, his stance steady and deliberate. The man's gaze fell immediately on the girl, and though no words passed, Sam sensed a language deeper than speech. He knew then that tribal laws were not just rules written on paper, but living echoes carried in blood and spirit. They governed more than land or property. They bound families, shaped destinies, and demanded loyalty that transcended choice. The girl rose slowly, meeting the man's gaze without flinching. Sam watched as a silent exchange passed between them, something unyielding and ancient. The man's eyes softened briefly, then hardened again, a sign that decisions were being weighed, judgments quietly made. Sam understood the unspoken truth. By sheltering her, he had stepped into a world where laws were enforced not by courts or governments, but by traditions older than the settlers' claims. This was a realm where honor and duty intertwined with bloodlines and spirits, and where outsiders were often seen as threats rather than allies. The man nodded once, a gesture heavy with meaning. He turned and left without another word, leaving behind a silence thick with warning and possibility. Sam felt the tension tighten, the fragile peace shattered by the weight of rules he barely understood. As the fire crackled between them, the girl met Sam's eyes and spoke quietly, her voice steady but edged with resolve. "They come for me not as enemies, but as law." The truth hung between them, a challenge and a call to face the past, no matter the cost. Before the first light of dawn had touched the horizon, the stillness around the cabin was broken by the distant rhythm of pounding hooves. Sam stood at the porch, his breath rising in quick white bursts, eyes narrowing against the cold and the creeping unease settling in his chest. The girl was behind him, silent but alert, the faintest tension tightening her shoulders. From the ridge, shadows appeared, dozens of riders, mounted and moving with a deliberate, unhurried purpose. Their faces were painted in bold streaks of red and black, eyes fierce and unyielding beneath heavy brows. Spears glinted faintly in the dim light, but no weapons were raised. It was a procession heavy with meaning, a silent assertion that words could not convey. At their head rode a man wrapped in a cloak of black wolf fur, his horse adorned with feathers stained in ochre and ash. His gaze swept over the land, and then landed firmly on the cabin, on the two figures standing frozen in the cold morning air. Sam's jaw tightened. This was no casual visit. It was a reckoning. The riders circled the cabin with practiced precision, forming a ring that felt both protective and threatening. The cold bit deeper as the horses shifted, their breath steaming in the frosty air. Sam stepped forward, hands loose at his sides, refusing to show fear he didn't fully feel. The girl moved beside him, standing tall and steady despite the weight of so many eyes. The man in the wolf cloak dismounted with a quiet authority, snow crunching beneath his boots as he approached. His face was carved with the years of leadership and hard choices, his eyes dark pools that held ancient knowledge. Without raising his voice, he acknowledged the girl with a single word, "Daughter." There was no warmth in it, only the gravity of law and blood. Sam watched the silent exchange, knowing the fragile peace they'd held was about to be tested. The dawn broke pale and cold, casting long shadows over a moment that would change everything. The air between the cabin and the circle of warriors was thick with unspoken history and expectation. The chief's gaze held Sam's, steady and unwavering, as if measuring the man's soul against invisible scales forged by generations. The others stood silently, their painted faces and steady posture a reminder that this was not just about one girl, but about the honor and laws that shaped their people. Sam felt the weight of tradition pressing down on him, heavier than any burden he had carried before. This was a world ruled not by written statutes or elected officials, but by customs older than the land itself, customs that demanded respect, loyalty, and sometimes sacrifice. To break those laws was to fracture the very fabric of a community's identity. The girl stepped forward, her posture proud despite the tension. Her voice was calm, but resolute as she spoke in her native tongue, a language Sam didn't understand but felt in his bones. She claimed her choice, to stay, to live by her own will, not as property or possession, but as a person who had survived and fought for freedom. The chief's eyes darkened, flickering with both pain and resolve. He spoke slowly, each word carrying the weight of generations, a reminder that bonds were sacred and breaking them came with consequences. The law was not simply about control, but about protection of family, honor, and balance. Sam listened, feeling the clash between the world he knew and the one the girl had been born into. His own grief and solitude seemed distant now, overshadowed by the magnitude of what stood before them. He understood that this moment was not just a confrontation, but a challenge to prove who he was, not by words, but by actions and respect. The chief's hand rested briefly on the girl's shoulder, a gesture heavy with meaning, acknowledgement without surrender. The circle of warriors tightened slightly, their silence speaking volumes. Sam glanced at the girl, whose eyes met his with fierce determination. Whatever the path ahead, they would have to walk it together, carrying the weight of tradition on shoulders that had already borne too much. The days that followed carried a strange stillness, as if the very air held its breath between two worlds, one shaped by Sam's quiet solitude and the other by the fierce rhythms of a culture older than the land itself. Inside the cabin, the girl moved with a steady grace, her presence both a comfort and a reminder of the fragile balance they now walked. Sam found himself caught in the space between past and present, between the life he had known and the uncertain path unfolding before him. His hands, once steady with the simplicity of routine, now trembled with the weight of decisions that stretched beyond fences and horses. The girl, too, seemed suspended, caught between the expectations of her people and the freedom she had found here. She taught him glimpses of her world in quiet moments. The way she braided leather with careful fingers, the songs she hummed softly in a language thick with meaning, the stories hinted at in her eyes when she gazed toward the distant horizon. Sam listened, learning to read the silences and the spaces between words, understanding that some things were carried in spirit rather than speech. Outside, the prairie stretched vast and unforgiving, a land shaped by survival and strength. It was a place that had borne witness to countless struggles, of tribes forced to bend or break, of settlers carving out claims, of lives lived in defiance and hope. Here, the past was never far beneath the surface, and the present was a delicate negotiation. Sam realized that his grief, once a solitary burden, was now woven into something larger. He was no longer alone in his fight, nor was the girl simply a stranger seeking refuge. They were bound by more than circumstance, a shared desire for belonging, for understanding, for a future not dictated by fear or loss. Between two worlds, they stood at a crossroads. The land whispered its ancient truths around them, and in the quiet moments, Sam understood that the journey ahead would demand more than strength. It would demand heart. The sky darkened unexpectedly that afternoon, heavy clouds rolling in like a silent warning across the endless prairie. The wind shifted, carrying a sharper edge that tugged at the cabin's loose shingles and stirred the dry grass into restless waves. Inside, the fire crackled, but the warmth felt fragile against the growing tension outside. Sam stood by the window, eyes fixed on the horizon where dust swirled in faint, distant spirals. The air held a charged stillness, the kind that precedes a storm not just of weather, but of reckoning. The riders would return soon. He could feel it in the tightness of his chest, the unspoken urgency hanging in the room between him and the girl. She moved with purpose now, preparing quietly but steadily. Her hands tied leather straps tighter, braided her hair back firmly, and checked the bandage on her arm. There was no fear in her movements, only resolve born from knowing the fight ahead was inevitable. She met Sam's gaze briefly, a flicker of unspoken understanding passing between them. Outside, the first rumble of thunder echoed, low and distant, a haunting drumbeat that seemed to synchronize with the pounding of Sam's heart. The storm was gathering, not just the one in the sky, but the one on the horizon of their lives. It carried the weight of ancient laws, broken bonds, and the promise of confrontation. Sam reached for his rifle, the cold steel a comfort he knew wouldn't be enough. This was a battle beyond bullets, a test of spirit, of honor, and of choices made in the face of unforgiving tradition. He slid the weapon back against the wall, knowing that the coming storm demanded more than force. The wind howled through the trees as the first heavy drops of rain began to fall, mingling with the distant thunder. The prairie seemed to hold its breath once more, waiting. Inside the cabin, two figures stood side by side, ready to face whatever came with a fierce quietness. The gathering storm was no longer just a warning. It was a promise that the past would not be forgotten, and the future would be claimed with courage. The morning dawned heavy with gray skies, the rain still dripping from swollen clouds that clung low over the land. Sam stood silently outside the cabin, the chills seeping into his bones despite the layers of worn wool wrapped around him. The girl, now steady and resolute, joined him without a word, their footsteps muted on the wet earth. Soon, figures appeared at the edge of the clearing, warriors adorned in traditional dress, faces painted with solemn symbols that spoke of heritage and authority. They moved with purpose, their presence commanding a respect that transcended words. Among them was the chief, his eyes sharp and steady, carrying the weight of his people's judgment. This was no ordinary trial, no matter how much Sam wished it could be. The law here was not bound by paper or precedent, but by honor, tradition, and the balance between kinship and consequence. The girl's fate, and by extension, Sam's, would be decided in this sacred gathering, where voices were fewer but meaning ran deeper. They sat in a circle beneath the shelter of tall pines, rain pattering softly on branches above. The chief spoke first, his voice low but carrying through the hush. He outlined the grievances, the bonds broken, the challenges brought by her departure and Sam's protection. His words were measured, neither accusatory nor forgiving, but carrying the weight of history. The girl responded with steady clarity, declaring her choice and the reasons behind it. She spoke not just for herself, but for the right to live freely, to claim her own path beyond the strict confines of ownership and expectation. Sam listened, admiring the strength in her voice and the courage to face the judgment of her people. The warriors exchanged glances, their silence heavy with consideration. The chief finally rose, signaling a verdict that would shape the days to come. It was a moment suspended between worlds, between old law and new hope, between loss and the possibility of belonging. Sam and the girl stood side by side, ready to accept whatever came, knowing that their trial was more than a judgment. It was the first step toward a fragile reconciliation. The rain had eased to a gentle drizzle, leaving the earth slick and dark beneath their boots. Inside the cabin, shadows clung to the corners as Sam and the girl moved about in quiet rhythms. The trial had passed, but its echoes lingered, unspoken questions and guarded glances that hinted at truths yet to surface. Sam sensed there was more beneath her calm exterior than she let on. Moments flickered like half-remembered dreams, her eyes clouding briefly with pain, her fingers tightening around a worn charm tucked beneath her shirt. The past she carried was heavier than the wounds visible to the eye. One evening, as the fire sputtered low, she spoke softly, her voice barely above the crackling flames. She told fragments of a story, a betrayal by those she once trusted, a loss so profound it left scars deeper than flesh could show. Her words painted shadows of broken alliances and secrets guarded fiercely within the tribe's walls. Sam listened intently, realizing that their struggle was not just about law or survival, but about trust betrayed and wounds hidden beneath the surface. The girl's fight was not only for freedom, but for healing from wounds that ran through generations. In turn, he shared pieces of his own past, the war that had taken more than he could bear, the silence he'd wrapped himself in since. Though their stories were different, they resonated with the same undercurrent of loss and the fragile hope for something better. Night after night, these exchanges deepened their bond, carving space for understanding where suspicion had once lived. The cabin transformed from shelter into a sanctuary, a place where secrets could be laid bare without fear. Outside, the wind stirred the trees, carrying the scent of rain and earth. Beneath the surface of their quiet life, the currents of past and present flowed together, weaving a new path, one that would test their strength and shape the future they dared to claim. The days grew colder, and the weight of the approaching winter pressed heavily on the land. Sam worked steadily around the homestead, but the tension lingering in the air was impossible to ignore. The trial had left its mark, and while the immediate threat had passed, dangers both seen and unseen still circled like wolves at the edge of the forest. One morning, a visitor arrived, unexpected and out of place. Miss Lahi, the storekeeper from the nearby town, came riding up the dusty road, her face etched with concern but also a quiet determination. Sam hadn't expected allies in the town, where judgment and suspicion often lingered longer than kindness. Yet, here she was, bringing news and a cautious offer of help. Inside the cabin, over steaming mugs of bitter coffee, Miss Lahi spoke softly but clearly. She had heard whispers, rumors that stirred unrest and threatened to drag both Sam and the girl back into conflict. Yet she also spoke of those in town who believed in fairness, who saw beyond old prejudices and were willing to stand for what was right. Sam listened, surprised by the quiet strength behind her words. She offered to watch for signs of trouble, to spread word carefully, and to remind the town that sometimes courage meant standing with the vulnerable, not turning away. The gesture was small, but in a world where trust was scarce, it was a beacon. The girl, too, observed Miss Lahi closely, recognizing in her a rare kind of ally, a bridge between worlds. It was an alliance born not from shared history, but from shared hope and the understanding that survival often required unexpected friendships. As the visitor left, the cabin felt a little less isolated, the burden a little lighter. The road ahead remained uncertain, but with allies in unlikely places, Sam and the girl found new strength. Together, they began to navigate a landscape where trust was fragile, but sometimes, just sometimes, it could be found in the most surprising corners. The cold bit sharper that morning, frost glinting on the edges of leaves and stiffening the earth beneath their boots. Sam and the girl stood side by side near the edge of the woods, the distant mountains looming like silent guardians. Today was more than routine. It was a challenge set by the chief, a test of both courage and heart that would measure more than strength. Sam held the bow in his hands, an old weapon that had once been lifeline and burden. The girl watched him, her eyes steady, silently offering support rather than instructions. She understood the weight of what was asked, not just to hunt, but to prove himself worthy of trust, respect, and a place within a world foreign to him. They moved together through the underbrush, quiet and deliberate, following signs only she seemed to see. The way the branches bent, the faint impressions in the soil, the scent carried on the cold breeze. It was a dance as much as a hunt, patience woven with instinct. When they found the deer, a young buck alert and wary, Sam's heart pounded not with fear, but with reverence. He remembered the lessons of war and loss, the promises made in silence. Slowly, carefully, he knocked the arrow and released it with steady hands. The arrow struck true, piercing just behind the shoulder. The deer faltered, then fell without struggle, a quiet end beneath the open sky. Sam exhaled, the tension draining as the weight of the moment settled around them. Back at the camp, the warriors waited silently, their faces unreadable as the chief approached. He studied Sam with piercing eyes, searching for the truth beyond the act. Then, without words, he nodded, a gesture that spoke of acceptance, of respect earned. The girl's hand found Sam's, fingers curling tightly as relief and gratitude passed between them. It was more than a hunt. It was a bridge between worlds, a promise that courage and heart could carve a path through even the deepest divides. As the sun dipped low, casting gold across the land, Sam felt something shift within, a quiet hope kindled by the day's trial, and the knowledge that they would face whatever came next together. The night settled over the prairie like a heavy cloak, but inside the cabin, the fire burned bright, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Sam sat by the hearth, the quiet crackle of flames matching the steady rhythm of his thoughts. The day's trial had tested more than his skill. It had tested his will, his heart, and his place in a world that still felt foreign and unforgiving. The girl moved about with a calm purpose, preparing a meal from the day's hunt. Her hands were steady, the scars of past battles hidden beneath the grace of each motion. Sam watched her, feeling a swell of admiration for her strength and the fierce independence that refused to be broken. In the silence between them, Sam realized that the fight ahead would require more than courage in the field. It would demand resolve, a quiet, unyielding determination to stand firm in the face of judgment and tradition, to protect what mattered most, even when the world seemed poised to tear it away. He thought of his wife, Marjorie, and the promises made in shadows long past. The pain of loss still lingered, but no longer weighed him down. Instead, it had forged a resolve within him, a will to fight not just for survival, but for belonging, for something better. The girl looked up, meeting his gaze with eyes that held both challenge and trust. There was no need for words. They understood each other in the language of shared battles and silent vows. Outside, the wind whispered through the cedars, carrying with it the echoes of the past and the uncertain promise of tomorrow. Sam rose, moving to stand beside her, the weight of grief replaced by the strength of purpose. Together, they faced the night, two souls bound by loss and hope, ready to confront whatever storms lay ahead. The widow's resolve was no longer a quiet retreat. It was a steady flame, burning brighter with every step toward an uncertain but shared future. The morning light filtered through the mist, casting pale shadows over the ancient stones that marked the edge of the tribal's sacred grounds. Sam and the girl stood at the threshold, the weight of generations pressing quietly around them. This was a place where the past was alive, in the whispered prayers, the worn carvings, and the soil steeped in memory. Sam felt the ache of old wounds rise within him, a reminder that some scars were not just flesh deep. The land carried stories of loss and resilience, battles fought not only with weapons, but with spirit. Here, laws were sacred, intertwined with the rhythms of nature and the honor of ancestors long gone. The girl moved with reverence, her footsteps light but certain as she approached a weathered cairn. Her hands traced the symbols etched into stone, a silent conversation with those who had walked before. She spoke softly in her native tongue, words that sounded like a song carried on the wind, an invocation of strength and healing. Sam watched, understanding that this place held more than ritual. It was a refuge, a reminder that identity was forged in both pain and connection. He knelt beside her, fingers brushing the earth, feeling the pulse of history beneath his skin. The sacred ground stirred something long buried, a shared recognition that wounds, no matter how deep, could find balm in tradition and truth. But alongside healing lay the reminder that the past could also bind, sometimes choking the present with the weight of unresolved grief. As the sun rose higher, casting gold over the stones and trees, Sam and the girl rose together, their shadows stretching long across the ground. They carried with them the knowledge that to move forward, they must face these old wounds honestly, honoring the sacred while forging their own path. The land held its breath, watching as two lives intertwined amid echoes of history, both scarred and strengthened by the sacred grounds they now called home. The weight of justice settled over the cabin like a heavy fog, thick and unyielding. Sam sat quietly, the lines etched deep across his weathered face mirroring the turmoil inside. Outside, the wind whispered through bare branches, carrying the faint echo of voices, old grievances, unspoken truths, and a relentless demand for reckoning. Justice here was not a simple measure of right and wrong. It was a burden carried by many, woven from threads of honor, tradition, and the scars left by generations of conflict. Sam understood that his presence with the girl had stirred something far beyond his control, an awakening of old wounds and new challenges. The girl moved with a solemn grace, her eyes reflecting the gravity of their shared predicament. She spoke little, but each word she did offer was weighted with meaning, a reminder that justice was not only about laws, but about healing fractured trust. Sam thought of the choices that had led them here, the risks taken to protect, the courage to defy expectations, and the fragile hope that love and respect might carve a path through the storm. Yet, he also knew the cost, the sacrifices demanded by a world that balanced mercy with tradition, compassion with consequence. A knock came at the door, sharp and insistent. Sam rose, heart tightening as the chief's voice filled the room, a summons to face the judgment that awaited beyond the cabin walls. The moment was heavy with inevitability. Together, they stepped into the cold morning, the eyes of the community upon them. The burden of justice was not theirs alone. It belonged to all who had been shaped by history's relentless hand. As they walked toward the gathering, Sam felt a steady resolve settle within. Justice might be a burden, but it was also a calling to confront the past honestly, to seek truth with courage, and to find a way forward, no matter how difficult the path. The evening air hung heavy with smoke and embers as Sam and the girl sat close by the campfire outside the cabin. The flames flickered and danced, casting warm light that softened the harsh edges of the day's trials. Around them, shadows stretched long, but in the fire's glow, there was a fragile comfort, a momentary peace earned through struggle and shared resolve. Sam watched her hands, steady as they worked on a leather strap, weaving and knotting with practiced care. The quiet determination in her movements mirrored the steady pulse of the fire, resilient, enduring. It was here, amid the crackle of burning wood and the cool night air, that something deeper began to take shape. A bond forged not in ease, but in the heat of hardship. They spoke little, words unnecessary in this place where understanding grew from presence and touch rather than speech. Sam reached out slowly, his fingers brushing hers in a tentative gesture, a silent promise carried between them like the sparks rising into the night sky. The girl met his gaze, eyes reflecting the flames, and something softer, trust perhaps, or hope. For all the shadows that clung to their pasts, here was a moment free from judgment and fear. It was a beginning, fragile and uncertain, but no less real. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees, carrying the scent of pine and rain to mingle with the fire's warmth. The night seemed to hold its breath, as if honoring this quiet union. In the days and nights to come, they would face storms both literal and unseen. But beneath the vast, unyielding sky, by firelight and choice, Sam and the girl had forged a bond strong enough to withstand the trials ahead. A bond not of possession, but of respect, courage, and the slow, steady forging of two lives entwined. The night was still and deep. The sky stretched wide above the cabin with stars that glittered like distant fires. Sam sat outside, wrapped in a heavy blanket, the chill of the prairie night softened only by the steady glow of the dying fire. Beside him, the girl's presence was quiet but unmistakable, a steady rhythm in the vast silence. The wind carried whispers, voices from the past, ancient and enduring. They spoke in a language older than words, a chorus of ancestors whose lives and stories had shaped the land beneath their feet. The girl lifted her face to the sky, eyes closed, as if listening to those invisible echoes that threaded through the night. Sam watched, sensing the weight of heritage that rested on her shoulders, the silent prayers, the strength drawn from generations who had faced hardship and held to hope. In those moments, the past felt close, alive, and a part of the present. She spoke softly then, words carried on the breeze, a chant, a song, a calling to the spirits who watched over their people. Sam could not understand the language, but the tone was reverent, filled with both sorrow and defiance. He felt a stirring within himself, a connection to something greater than grief or solitude. The ancestors' voices were not just echoes. They were a guide, a source of strength and wisdom that bridged the distance between two worlds. As the firelight flickered and the stars wheeled overhead, Sam reached out, his hand finding hers. Together, they listened to the night's song, feeling the enduring presence of those who had come before, warriors, healers, lovers, and survivors. In the quiet that followed, Sam understood that their journey was part of a larger story, one written not just in blood and bone, but in the voices of ancestors who whispered courage and resilience across the ages. The dawn broke over the prairie with a pale, uncertain light, casting long shadows that stretched across the snow-dusted ground. Sam stood outside the cabin, the cold biting through his coat, his breath misting in the still air. Beside him, the girl was silent but alert, the weight of the day pressing heavily upon them both. Today was not just another day. It was the moment where law and mercy would clash, where tradition met the fragile hope of compassion. The tribal council awaited their arrival, the gathering place where decisions were made not only by rules, but by the hearts of those who held the power to shape lives. As they approached, the air thickened with tension. Faces, painted and solemn, turned toward them, eyes measuring, judging, searching for signs of guilt or grace. The council elders sat in a circle, guardians of customs that had endured for centuries, their silence louder than any accusation. The chief spoke first, his voice steady and commanding, reciting the law that bound their people. It was a code written in blood and spirit, demanding accountability and respect. The girl's choice to stay, to claim her freedom, challenged that law, a defiance both brave and dangerous. Sam stepped forward, his voice calm but firm, pleading not for leniency, but for understanding. He spoke of mercy, not as weakness, but as strength born from love and respect. He urged the council to see beyond tradition's rigidity and honor the girl's right to choose her own path. The elders exchanged long, deliberate glances, the air heavy with the weight of their decision. Mercy and law intertwined, pulling at one another like opposing winds. Finally, the chief nodded, a gesture both solemn and hopeful. The verdict was neither surrender nor conquest, but a fragile balance. Respect for the law tempered by the courage to bend for compassion. Sam and the girl felt the burden ease, yet knew the path ahead remained uncertain. Together, they stepped back into the cold light of morning, carrying the fragile gift of mercy, a choice that would define not only their future, but the meaning of justice itself. The large wooden circle of the tribal council was quiet, save for the crackling of the fire pit at its center. Sam and the girl stepped into the ring of elders, their footsteps steady but measured under the weight of so many eyes. The painted faces around them bore the lines of age, wisdom, and judgment, each one silent but commanding. The chief's voice broke the stillness, firm and deliberate, addressing them both with the gravity that only tradition could bestow. His words outlined the responsibilities and consequences carried by their actions, speaking of honor, family, and the balance that must be preserved. The council was not a place for haste or mercy alone. It was a crucible where the past met the present, forging the future. The girl met each gaze with quiet strength, her posture unwavering despite the heavy scrutiny. Sam watched her, feeling a mixture of pride and concern. He knew this was more than a ceremony. It was a test of resolve, a moment where their fates would be weighed not just in law, but in spirit. One elder stepped forward, voice gruff but fair, recounting the history that bound their people and the sacred laws that guided them. The words were sharp, a reminder that freedom came with responsibility, and that every choice echoed beyond the self. Sam raised his voice, steady and sincere, speaking of respect for those laws, but also of the courage it took to live by one's own truth. He asked the council to see the girl not as a challenge to tradition, but as a bridge to understanding, a living testament to change born from respect and love. The council exchanged long, thoughtful glances. Silence stretched before the chief finally nodded, a signal that the verdict was reached. It was a quiet acceptance, a promise that their bond would be honored, and that the future might be shaped by courage as much as by law. As they stepped away from the circle, the weight lifted slightly. Facing the tribal council had been daunting, but it was a step toward a new beginning, one built on trust, respect, and the fragile hope of harmony. The wind shifted, carrying with it a change that seemed to ripple through the air and the hearts of those who lived on the prairie. The once frozen ground beneath their feet began to soften, signaling the first promise of thaw and renewal. Sam and the girl walked side by side toward the cabin, their steps lighter despite the weight of the days behind them. News of the council's decision spread slowly but surely through the nearby town and tribal lands. Whispers turned to conversations, and conversations to cautious acceptance. The tide was turning, not just in the hearts of individuals, but in the quiet shifting of old fears and hardened judgments. Miss Lahi greeted them with a nod of respect when they passed the general store, her eyes reflecting the same hope that stirred quietly in Sam's chest. Townsfolk began to look past old prejudices, their glances less wary, their words softer. The girl, once seen as an outsider and a source of conflict, was slowly becoming a part of a larger story, a story of resilience, change, and the possibility of harmony. Inside the cabin, the fire burned steadily, a symbol of warmth against the lingering chill. Sam and the girl shared meals, laughter even, and moments of quiet understanding. The land around them seemed to breathe easier, as if welcoming the fragile peace growing between two worlds once held apart by fear. Yet, beneath the surface of this turning tide lay the truth that change was never without resistance. Old wounds still throbbed in hidden corners, and shadows of doubt lingered in some eyes. But for the first time in many moons, hope was not just a whispered dream, but a light they could follow. As the sun set, painting the sky with hues of gold and rose, Sam felt a steady strength take root within him. The journey was far from over, but the tide had turned, and with it came the promise that together they could navigate the uncertain waters ahead, forging a future built on trust, courage, and the enduring power of choice. The days grew longer, and with them came a gradual loosening of the bonds that had held Sam and the girl captive in suspicion and fear. The chains of old judgments, though heavy, began to crack beneath the steady pressure of patience and understanding. Trust, fragile as new green shoots after winter, pushed its way through the hardened ground between them and the world around. In the quiet moments of shared labor, mending fences, tending animals, weaving leather, something profound took root. The girl's laughter, once rare and guarded, grew more frequent, mingling with the soft sounds of the prairie wind. Sam found himself watching her with a new kind of hope, a sense that the wounds of the past were not the sum of their story. Neighbors, once distant and wary, started to linger with cautious smiles and tentative greetings. Miss Lahi brought fresh fabric and herbs, small offerings that spoke of acceptance. A boy from a nearby farm asked to learn how to weave arrow fletchings, drawn by the girl's skill and quiet strength. These were small steps, but each one a victory against the shadow of history. Inside the cabin, the fire burned warm and steady, a symbol of a life being built, not just surviving but thriving. Sam and the girl shared stories, dreams, and silences, each moment weaving a tapestry of trust that grew stronger with time. They understood that breaking chains was not about forgetting or erasing the past, but about facing it honestly and choosing connection over division. Trust was earned in acts of kindness, in the courage to be vulnerable, and in the quiet persistence of love.